thank you, Emily. That's a very nice introduction to this presentation, which is going to be the substance or the meat or the filling or of what the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index is about. As Emily mentioned, this was an undertaking which we started talking about sometime like March of last year. So it's been a whole year in development. It's been quite intense. I will not say that there were no moments of frayed nerves, because there were. It was done in very. It was an intense effort, and we hope that the results justify that effort. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So Emily has also mentioned all the people that we need to thank. And so aside from our team members from IFPRI and OFI, I also want to thank our collaborators in the field in Bangladesh, Uganda, and Guatemala, whom I'll talk about later, who made piloting this possible. Okay, so what was the purpose of the index? The purpose of the index was really to design, develop, and test an index to measure the greater inclusion of women in agricultural sector growth, which occurred, or which will occur as a result of the Feed the Future initiative. And so this brings us to ask the question, what is greater inclusion? It's a broad concept, it's a multidimensional concept, therefore it has to be measured in multidimensional ways. IFPRI is known for developing its gender research. We're quite known for that, but we are not index people. So therefore, it really made sense for USAID to matchmake this collaboration between IFPRI and OFI, which has, of course, pioneered the development of multidimensional indices. So what is inclusive agricultural sector growth? So Feed the Future defines it as the empowerment of women in their roles and their engagement throughout the various areas of the agricultural sector as it grows in both quantity and quality. Why do we focus on women? If you've been coming to policy seminars at IFPRI and have been following our work, a lot of this is already old hat to you. Women are important in agriculture, accounting for 43% of the agricultural labor force worldwide. Yet they consistently have less resources than men. Simulations done for the SOFA show that women tend to have less land, education, access to extension and credit, and to inputs. And this disparity in resources leads to yield gaps of between 20 to 25%. Closing the gap in access to these resources could increase agricultural productivity with benefits for families and for the next generation. Now, what is new about the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index? I'm going to give you a very broad overview, and when Sabina comes on, she'll tell you more about the details. So it's an aggregate index in two parts. There's the index part called the 5DE, the 5 domains of empowerment, which assesses whether women are empowered in the 5 domains of empowerment in agriculture. We'll see this in a little bit. And then there is a gender parity index, GPI, which reflects the percentage of women who are as empowered as the men in their households. Now, what's different about this index is that it's not based on aggregate statistics. As we were preparing for the launch in New York, we found out that there is actually another gender parity index, which is done by UNESCO, which is based on enrollment rates. But that's not based on household surveys. The important thing about this index is it's survey-based. It's based on responses from men and women themselves. It's constructed using interviews of the primary male and the primary female adults in the same household. So let's take a look at what these 5 domains are and what are the indicators which make up the domains. So guidance on what the domains were came from USAID. And I think this is a product of a lot of internal discussion. One was decision-making over production or productive activities in agriculture. Second was control and ownership of resources. Third was control of income. Fourth was leadership in the community. And fifth was time use. Now, how to operationalize these indicators and to extract them into things that we could use in an index, what we did then was to develop a questionnaire which captured these 5 dimensions. We didn't actually know which of the questions we put in were going to end up being used in the index. So if you ever had a chance to look at the old pilot questionnaire, it was very thick. Don't worry. For those of you wanting to adopt it, it is much shorter now because we've cut down the gazillion indicators to 10 indicators. So under the in the production area, there are two indicators: input into productive decisions, and second is autonomy in production. What we mean by autonomy is not whether I went and dug the field myself. It's more as did I have autonomy in decision-making over these areas of agricultural production. In the area of resources, there are three indicators: sole or joint ownership of assets, of land and assets, whether you were involved in joint or sole decision-making on the purchase, sale, or transfer of land and assets, and whether you had access to and made decisions on credit. What's important here is that it's not only sole decision-making, but also jointness of decision-making that counts. Because in many cultures, what's important is that a man or a woman has a say. It's not just that you're the only person who has a say, but that you have a say in the decision-making process. The third domain is income, and this is control over the use of income. The community leadership domain has two indicators: whether you're a member of a group, and these are different kinds of groups which are listed in the questionnaire, and whether you feel comfortable speaking in public. And finally, the time use indicator the time use domain has two indicators. One is the number of hours spent in productive and reproductive tasks, whether it's above a certain threshold, and whether you're satisfied with the distribution of leisure time. So, of course, before you go out and implement this in all 19 Feed the Future countries, it is, of course, a responsible thing to do to first test whether it's going to work. So we had to test the feasibility in a real-world setting before scaling up. So what we did was to pilot the new survey instrument in 3 countries, which are part of the Feed the Future initiative. We wanted the countries which had very different social and cultural contexts and with very different gender roles. These are Bangladesh, Guatemala, and Uganda, with about 350 households or 625 individuals each, focusing on the Feed the Future zones of influence, or the geographic areas targeted by initiative in each country. So it's representative of a zone of influence, and it's not nationally representative. So that's an important thing to note. This was done purposely because in some countries, Feed the Future is targeted to specific areas, and others it's national. And we wanted to make sure that we were getting the area where they were going to be working. So the other thing I want to say is that because this was a pilot, it's an innovation in the measurement and monitoring of women's empowerment in agriculture, and it's not the final word on it. It may not apply to your specific context, so we encourage people to modify the survey instrument as it fits, but of course keeping within the parameters of the index, because if you modify it too much, then it's going to become something else. My analogy for indices is that there are indices and there are indices. There are many kinds of indices. One thing I like about this index is that you know exactly how it's constructed. It's like a recipe. People can tweak recipes, but if you really swap out the ingredients too much, you're not cooking the same thing. Okay. So what were the innovations in survey design and implementation? Okay, the index components were designed to be applicable across countries and cultures. So that meant, for example, if we're looking at an asset bundle, we have to look at assets or be able to define the assets in such a way that if you're farming in Africa or if you're farming in Bangladesh, the assets module could still be used and comparable. Men and women from the same household are interviewed. The survey questionnaire modules focuses on men's and women's empowerment in agriculture. This makes it different from other surveys which are nationally representative, like the DHS, for example, which tends to look at empowerment in terms of decision-making over certain decisions like household expenditures, taking children to the doctor, decisions on schooling. This one really focuses on agriculture, and we found that this is a big gap in terms of existing surveys. There are many surveys on empowerment, but very little looking at empowerment in agriculture. And the index also applies to women in households with male adults, as well as those with only female adults. Most other studies looking at women's empowerment have focused only on women and not in comparison to the men in their households. In addition to the pilot survey, we also undertook case studies. And these case studies were really key in getting what people really understood by empowerment. So they consisted of interviews on 5 domains. with narratives where people explained their answers, told their life stories, and got the concepts of empowerment from women and men themselves. What's very interesting here is that even the concepts of empowerment really varied cross-culturally. So a woman in Guatemala who was age 63 said, for example, that being empowered means that a woman can do things also, not just a man. So, as I mentioned earlier, we piloted this in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Guatemala, and Uganda. It was split roughly 20-80 between single, female, and dual adult households. This was because we wanted to oversample the female-headed households, so we would have enough sample size for that category. I want to thank our collaborators who fielded this pilot very quickly and quite amazingly. Data analysis and technical assistance in Bangladesh, VOS Latina in Guatemala, and Associates Research Uganda Limited in Uganda. I mean, quite a lot of effort went into training the interviewers, and in Bangladesh, we have worked with data for a long time. Amy Margolis did a fantastic job training the enumerators of VOS. And Amber Peterman actually spent a lot of time in the field with our role in Uganda as well. So I'm going to take you on a very quick virtual tour so that I don't take away time from Sabina, who's going to talk about what the index is really about. In Bangladesh, the pilot was in the southern part of the country with a sample size of about 450 households. So it's the area quite close to the Indian border. In Guatemala, the pilot was conducted in the Western Highlands, which is notable for its large indigenous population. It's also an area which is quite poor. The sample size consisted of 250 households. And in Uganda, the zone of influence is actually the whole country. So our pilots were conducted in northern, central, and eastern Uganda with 350 households each. So I'm now going to turn this over to Sabina, and I'll turn it over to our tech people because Sabina is joining us virtually.